What I want to do this morning is to tell you a story about what we're doing, and hopefully, in the context of that, tell you another story embedded in it about why we're doing it. And then if we have time, and this will mostly be in the questions, I think, to also confess all the things that we haven't quite figured out yet about how to do what we're trying to do. So, as was mentioned in the introduction, the story I want to tell you about today is about an initiative that we've developed in UNDP to create a network of accelerator labs with the aim of creating the world's fastest learning network on solving development problems. And I want to try and cover 4 very brief things, just to add one more to Piret's 3, which is why we're doing what we're doing, what we're doing, how we're doing it, and why is UNDP doing it. And I'm going to kind of start at the bottom with UNDP and work our way up, because tomorrow, as I'm sure everybody in the audience knows, is a very special day. It is the 54th anniversary of the founding of UNDP. Hands up anybody who actually knew that. Don't worry. And for an organization that was set up 54 years ago with the aim to be the United Nations system's primary development agency, the agency that was tasked to help the developing world advance, 54 years is long overdue for a midlife crisis. Luckily, we're not facing a midlife crisis, but we have spent the last couple of years thinking very deeply, not only about what we do, but about how we go about doing what we do in the world that we live in today, which, as Piret alluded to just now, is a highly complex world where, to put it simply, most of the simple development problems in the world have largely been solved. And the ones that we as an organization and we as the global community are left with are the tricky, complex, wicked problems. So how do you set up an organization to help the world deal with those? And that was the question of why. And we talk about this internally in reference to a graph that was actually developed and shared with us by someone who's about to speak after me. And this is a graph that talks about the fact that when you look at the speed and scale at which complex problems are emerging in the world, whether it's climate change, whether it's technological advance, whether it is growing inequality within and between countries, whether it is the fracturing of societal systems and structures and the coherence of the societies that we depend on, when you look at all those problems, it is pretty clear that these problems are growing at a rate that far exceeds the rate at which we're coming up with solutions. So we're losing the battle. And in that context, for an organization like ours, the challenge is not just to do what we've been doing better, but to think deeply about different approaches. Otherwise, you just keep falling behind. So we're an organization facing a gamut of 21st century problems. At the age of 54 years old, being an organization that was designed and mandated to deal with 20th century problems. And so we came down to 3 key questions that you can see on the screen here behind me. How do we better tackle complex and fast-moving challenges? How do we find the most relevant solutions that work locally? Because one of the key insights that we came to was that most of the solutions that are required are highly context-specific. Not just because countries differ, but also because communities, neighborhoods, cities, localities, groups of people, groups of identities are different, and the solutions that work in one very specific multidimensional context do not automatically translate into another. So to give you an example, here in Finland, I know from talking to friends and colleagues that there is a growing issue around aging societies, the demographic transitions around that play off in different ways in rural areas versus urban areas. This is in many ways, at a headline level, exactly the same story that you see in Thailand or in Malaysia. But we cannot assume that a solution that's developed here in Finland could simply be transported to Thailand or vice versa. And last but not least, given that the problems are complex and that the contexts are very, very specific, how do we actually learn more quickly about what works and what doesn't? The assumption being that the only way in which you know what is applicable on the ground is to try it, to adapt and to learn, and to refine what you're doing as you go along. So what are we doing? What we decided to do is to establish an initiative with the highly audacious and almost impertinent task of catalyzing positive change by finding and sharing solutions as fast and as rapidly as anyone in the world has ever tried to do. So we set ourselves the ambition of working with a group of partners to set up the world's largest and fastest learning network embedded within our organization. What does this look like? To start off with, we have established teams in 60 of our offices, covering 78 countries, encompassing the majority of the developing world, mandated to be the initial nodes in this network. Small 3-person teams embedded within our existing offices, and our offices range in size from about 30 people up to about 300, whose job it is to create a network using new skills and new capacities to speed the rate at which we find and solve problems. Oh, sorry. You'll also notice when you look at the map that the network itself is segmented in some unusual ways. First of all, roughly half the network is in continental Africa. The reason being that we are of the conviction that if we are going to solve the development problems of the next couple of decades, the space that's really going to matter is Africa. Secondly, you'll see that the countries that we cover here are of a broad typology. So we have everything from labs that work in the small island states in the Pacific, to a lab in Buenos Aires that works in Argentina, to a lab in Delhi in India, where we have 3 extremely smart and competent colleagues sitting in the office going, how the heck do we come up with solutions for India? So we're working at a span of different contexts and typologies, and we're also working in different types of countries. About a quarter of the countries that you see on this list are what we call conflict and fragile countries. Countries that are either pretty much at the moment in a state of sustained conflict or just emerging out of it. About 25% of them are also less developed countries, and a majority of the others are middle income and upper middle income countries. So quite advanced societies and economies, all down through to places where we're still dealing with the remnants of hot war. The reason we developed a network of this diversity is precisely because we believe a diversity in the network allows us to learn and speed up the scale of learning faster. I'm going to run through these pretty quickly because I just want to tell the story of what we're doing and then talk a little bit more about the why and the how. So the lab network works in a very simple way. A core team of colleagues equipped with a suite of tools and methodologies, a starter kit, so to speak, and I'll come into what these are later, with a way of working that essentially tasks them to speed up the rate at which we test and explore solutions within our existing portfolios, embedded within our existing teams, working side by side with the existing colleagues in our UNDP offices in these locations and their partners, their counterparts, and their local ecosystems, networked together around the world, using the best we have at the moment in terms of tools, protocols, tweaks for culture, tweaks for communication systems to encourage this cohort of people to share not just solutions and successes, which is the default of what is shared in bureaucracies, but also to share failures, which we always aspire to share intuitions, to share hunches, to share uncertainties. And we assume, and we are building this on the assumption that the network effects of sharing that depth of insight across a network will surface intuitions and weak signals that we can then glean for the benefit of our work overall. How? We've equipped these teams with a suite of initial tools, and I stress very much initial tools to get them started. And these map into 4 broad areas. Firstly, around sense-making. Tools and approaches to let our teams get a better sense of what is happening in the environments within which they operate. This is everything from ethnography to the use of big data, collective intelligence tools, etc., so that our teams and our partners on the ground have a deeper and wider sense of what is going on. What are the problems that we are seeing? Are these emerging in ways that we have not expected? Are there nuances or implications of these that we do not expect? And are there people working on them that we don't ordinarily see in our networks? Leveraging collective intelligence, as you say, simply the wisdom of the crowd, activated either through online platforms or through peer-to-peer learning on the ground. Working to map solutions. And this is very important because one of the key insights we've learned from talking to colleagues in this space is by the time people like us come into an environment and understand that a problem exists, you can bet there are people who live and breathe and work in those contexts who are already working on solutions. And one of the biggest problems, one of the biggest mistakes we have made in international development for a long time is to come into a context and assume that when we figured out what the problem is, we then have to solve that problem, ignoring the fact that very often on the ground, individuals, households, local communities, startups, government officials themselves have already been hacking solutions. And where you start is to first of all figure out who's already identified the problem and is working on it, and how do you bring them together into a network to leverage the expertise they already have and the resources they have available. So that is a key insight for us. And then out of all of this, how do we build protocols, partnerships, systems, resources to be able to rapidly test simultaneous portfolios of solutions? Because the other problem we've had working traditionally in development is that we have taken a very linear approach to the problem. Go in, do a diagnosis, design a project, implement a project. If you're lucky, while you're implementing the project, you might learn something. At the end of that process, learn the lessons you've learned, and then start the cycle again, rinse and repeat. And on average, in international development, a cycle like that takes 3 to 5 years. What we aim to do in this case is to start developing portfolios that we run at a pace of weeks or months simultaneously, so we're rapidly testing hypotheses all at the same time. The cycle the lab teams are trained to do is a 4-step. Sense what's going on. Understand the problem, understand the symptoms that might indicate there is a problem. Explore, both for local solutions, as well as looking for solutions across our collective network. Design and test portfolios of intuitions, hunches, experiments that may give you a sense of how the system reacts. And when you find a solution that potentially might work, look at whether that solution is scalable, whether it can grow. Because that's very often the acid test, whether that solution is robust or not. Our teams are now working on a protocol that pushes them to work through this cycle at 100-day sprints. They're at the moment in the first 30 days, the first 100-day cycle, and we're doing this for learning purposes, to push our teams to run through this sequence as often as possible, so we build the skill sets and the muscle memory of how to do this rapidly. Very quickly, and we'll come back to this later on because I want to have time for us to have a discussion as well. Sense making, looking for patterns, identifying relevance gaps. Exploration, tapping into uncommon data sources, talking to unusual suspects, looking not just for rigorous, evidence-based, tested data and solutions, but hints, intuitions, hunches, informal solutions, signals that signal there may be a way of solving this problem that we have often in the past overlooked because it did not meet that highly technocratic, evidence-based benchmark of what we consider to be a viable solution. Using collective intelligence as well, mapping sets of signals, sets of conversations to be able to extract out of those signals what can actually be going on the ground. Design and test, run portfolios, run quick experiments, do sprints to be able to very rapidly iterate through different interventions that might shift a system. And then when you find solutions that potentially could work, use the network to signal that outwards. Not to grow these by replicating them ourselves, but sharing these so that other people within a country can take them and scale them up, whether in government or elsewhere. Using these to influence government policy, so you shift the machinery of government to be able to work on these parts. And also looking to see whether these solutions are things that could be scaled out independently. Whether the group of people you bring together to hack a solution might be the nucleus of a startup or an NGO that could then essentially drift off from us into the local ecosystem to work together, or whether you're developing solutions that should actually be scaled through the private sector, spun off into ventures, given away as free IP to companies that may want to commercialize and use them, both within country and elsewhere. So that's the cycle. Now, the really interesting question, why on earth are we doing this? I started with this at the beginning, which is, we know as a development organization working on the ground in some of the toughest places in the world, that the set of solutions we have today are insufficient. They're not wrong. We're doing a lot of very good work on the ground, solving simple and complicated problems, and helping address many of the symptoms of the complex problems that the communities we work with are grappling with. But they're insufficient because we know we do not have the toolkits, the approaches, the resources, and the mental frames to be able to deal with the genuinely complex system-wide problems. As an international bureaucracy, we are not designed to deal with complex, ambiguous problems. We are designed to deal with clearly defined problems, complicated problems that can be broken down into pieces, where by solving each individual piece, you can roll up a solution for the whole. In a sense, we are designed for complicated engineering problems, not complex social problems. But when you're working in development, you're working intrinsically on complex social problems. So the why is simply that in order to do the job we need to do, we need to develop the skills and the tools and the approaches to be able to solve for complex systems problems. Let me talk a little bit now about the story within the story, why we're doing what we're doing. And I'll do that while I run through the slides that talk behind me about what UNDP is, because most of you are probably familiar with this. When we started thinking about how you take a bureaucracy of 17,000, 18,000 people working on the ground in 170 countries and communities, embedded within an international civil service, and we started thinking about how you spark change, one of the first points we came to is that the only way in which you can do this is by doing two things. One, jumping into the middle of the problem and starting to act. So we designed this initiative in the space of something like 4 months. From conceptualization to design to resourcing to startup. We set up and established these teams in the space of about another 6 months, which if any of you know the UN as a system or any given government style bureaucracy, going from idea to 180 people recruited, $85 million resources generated, a project up and running in 60 countries in very different locations in the space of less than a year is astounding. And we did it simply because we didn't break rules, because we are an international civil service and we don't break rules, but we bent as many as we needed to. We got permission from our leadership to just go ahead and do it. And that gave us a tremendous power, which is it sent a signal within the organization that it is possible for those people who believe we need to do something different to go out there and just do it. And the second intuition driving this is that the only way in which an organization like ours can develop the ability to deal with complex problems is by putting in an infrastructure at scale to do this simultaneously in many places. And I'll give you a confession here. When we first started talking about this idea with my boss, the head of UNDP, those of us who were kind of the champions of it said to him, look, we think we need to have a large network of labs. We need maybe 60 of them, and we'll set these up over the course of about 3 years. And Akim turned to us and went, it's a great idea. Yes, we're going to do this, and you're going to set up all 60 labs in the first year. Which is the point in time, by the way, that whatever hair I had left fell off my head. But he had a very simple point, which is if you're going to change a system, if you're going to spark a change in a large system, sometimes the signal needs to be strong enough that the entire system reacts. Pilot experiments are useful when you want to learn something, when you want to shift an entire system. Sometimes you need to insert basically a viral injection that changes the nature of the DNA of the entire organization. And that's what we're in the process of doing right now. By virtue of doing this, we're signaling to the organization that not only do we need to deal with complex problems, but that we need to go ahead and start doing it even if we haven't figured out all the solutions of how to do it. And we've signaled to the organization that if we are serious about being the world's leading development agency of the United Nations, when we do something like this, we have to be able to do it at scale. Not to say to our partners in governments, we're going to pilot this for 5 years and then write a report and then come back to you and maybe try doing it for another 5 years. Very last point on this, before I wrap up and move to questions. As we've entered into this process, this is really giving away the dirty secrets now. We're very conscious of the fact that a number of the things that we need in order to make this network successful, we don't have yet. Number one, we have given the teams we have on the ground an initial toolkit of methods, approaches, mental frameworks gleaned from many of the people around here, including people like Pirette and Indy and others, as an initial starter kit of solutions they could use. We know perfectly well these are insufficient. So as the teams work on the ground, we are still assembling the tools, approaches, methodologies they might need to do their jobs. Secondly, we know that this is only going to work if we develop a way for these teams on the ground to network amongst themselves at the speed and scale I talked about. Being a team and a culture that shares not just solutions and tested case studies, but uncertainties, risks, failures, intuitions, hunches. Within an international civil service, a highly global system of people from very different cultures working in different contexts, building the culture, the platform, the tools for sharing at that level is unprecedented. And right now, we haven't built that yet. We're working on it, but we're nowhere close to being where we need to be. And if we don't solve for that, we're not going to have a network, we're just going to have a collection of labs. So we're in that very uncertain space of knowing that one of the key bases of what we want to do hasn't been created yet. And last but not least, because there's been a tremendous amount of interest in what these labs are doing, we're also solving for the problem of a lot of people all over the world not only wanting to know what we're doing, but wanting to engage. And so we need to build a platform on which all of this sits that allows any of you and anyone else in the world who's interested to observe what our lab teams are doing, learn from that, and contribute seamlessly without having to navigate and arbitrage thousands of different individual interactions. So we've got lab teams with an insufficient toolkit of solutions, built on a network that itself is a work in progress, built on a platform that doesn't yet exist. And we're live at the moment, and we're doing this on the ground. And what we're hoping for is to find people out there who can help us solve all those questions all at once. So let me stop there. Thank you very much.